to the Ask the Scientist, where African speculative fiction meets scientific imagination. This is presented by the Applied African Speculative Fiction and the African Speculative Fiction Society. Thank you so much for being here. I would like to give our audience a little bit of time to come in. We've got 20 participants. Welcome, everyone. It is good to have you all. And welcome to our panelists. Just to give a bit of an introduction to this, this panel. So the project in question is the Applied African Speculative Fiction project, using narrative evidence in research policy and activism by the Imperial College. It was funded by the Imperial College and put together in collaboration with the University of Nairobi, the African Speculative Fiction Society, Vector Magazine, the International Black Speculative Writing Festival, and Sustainable AI Futures. And the point of it was to create educational resources, because a part of the ecosystem in African speculative fiction is that we don't always have a place where critical science fiction, a critical science fiction ecosystem of writers, scientists, doctors, and engineers, and futurists can interact and learn with each other. So this project is a small step towards building such an infrastructure. Essentially, it aims to connect writers with scientists on the continent to develop stories that can be useful in classrooms. We have at least 11 proposals from writers from Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, even Tanzania and Australia. And we'll be publishing stories as well from the diaspora, including Senegal, Uganda, and Nigeria, and possibly more. To tell us a little bit more about the program, and I'd like to give the panelists a chance to sort of introduce themselves. If we can start, we have with us Noreen Dorman. If you'd like to sort of say hello. We also have Gabriel Harry.
Hi.
We have Zan Van Ruyen.
Hello.
We have Dr. Nismus Mobonje.
Hello.
Dr. Aber Abrams.
Hello.
And Dr. Mercy Nyambura Mburu.
Hi.
So to tell us a little bit more about the program, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Mobonje to give us a little bit about the actual program and an overview of the initiative, why it exists, and what it hopes to do.
Thanks, Chinelo, and thanks everybody for making time to join this session this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are. The reason why we started or we came about with this project at Imperial was because we are very much STEM based. So it's science, technology, and engineering, and business based institution. And we realized that there is benefits in terms of bringing other disciplines together. There is strength in doing that. And this is how the project came about. And the idea was to sort of start it with Imperial and University of Nairobi, setting up small group seminars where we used different African speculative fiction stories with students in a small group seminar, and that they would also go away and develop essays which were then assessed by respective departments. One other thing, as Chinelo has elaborated, was to think through how can we sort of develop a framework or have a toolkit that can enhance the teaching of or bring African science fiction into higher education pedagogy. So this is sort of the background we set ourselves in order to take on the project. We've been supported along the way with African Speculative Society. They have brought quite a number of people into our space, into this project, and it's been quite useful. We've also done a number of seminars online. These have been mostly done online, where we bring people who are working in the space to provide more knowledge to our students, but not just our students, but the whole teaching community between the two institutions, but also other institutions in Africa, and in Kenya in more general.
So just to clarify, this panel, we really wanted to talk about not just science fiction, but how fiction and science can form collaborative connections with each other that inform both the science and the fiction. And so to that end, I'd love for each of our panelists to sort of briefly introduce themselves, give us their name, their discipline, and a little bit about the project or initiative that they worked on. Authors, you can talk about your story and your project, and scientists, you can share a little bit about your field and what drew you to collaborate. So yeah, Noreen, would you like to start?
Out of the frying pan into the fire. Okay, so for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm a South African-based editor, author, graphic design person, just sort of a creative all-rounder. When I was a wee lass, I wanted to be a conservationist and an astronaut and a rock star. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I went into graphic design. And I don't know, I've had a really weird career path, but my first love now at the moment is writing. And I get to blend with my writing all of the things that I'm interested in. So it's kind of like a happy medium. So this is when this opportunity came around, I was like, oh, wow, I really want to do something. And I had no idea what to do. And at the time, I was fascinated with this whole idea of de-extincting animals. But I wasn't sure how to do that in a sci-fi context. But I saw this proposal come out. And I thought, well, I'll give it a shot. But I just felt I was a little bit, I had no idea what I was doing. So I just wrote something and they said, hey, we've got somebody for you and this is what we're going to do. So I was quite nervous, and they paired me with a German Namibian researcher by the name of Annette Hibschel. And we met for coffee and we just absolutely hit it off. And it was supposed to be like an hour-long conversation, and we ended up like for 3 hours talking about a whole range of things that we're all very passionate about. And in that time, I kind of understood what the story was that I had to tell. And I don't normally write sci-fi. I do write sci-fi. I have an award-winning novel called Sing Down the Stars, which is a YA sci-fi novel that won a whole bunch of awards. But it's not something that I normally gravitate to. But I felt this was a story that I could sort of talk about the de-extinction, the ethics surrounding it, and the issues facing people who are passionate about doing their job. So although it's not sort of a very futuristic story, the scary thing is black rhinos are in all likelihood going to be extinct in less than 5 years if they go at the current rate that they're going at. And some of us have probably sort of heard about this whole initiative by Colossal Biosciences with those dire wolves, and their talk now of bringing back the moa, and they're working on the woolly mammoth and the thylacine. And I'm going to throw a little bit of Jurassic Park in here. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. And a lot of these scientists engage in what is known as fortressing. If you look, and as I said, the conversation that Annette and I ended up being a lot more about just de-extinction. We touched on illegal wildlife trade, poaching, the impact of fortressing, of conservation on communities, how communities often feel resentful because wild animals get better medical treatment than humans. and communities. I mean, what do? You're a subsistence farmer. The elephant breaks through the very flimsy fence and eats your entire year's maize crop in one night. You're going to starve. You want some reparation and nobody gives you any money and you starve. There's a lot of issues like that. So as I said, I think we had 5,000 words. I can't remember what the word count was. I had 5,000 words to pack in this huge story, and yet between me and Annette, we did it, and it was so exciting. And I was really excited when I wrote the story, and I can't wait to show to people because it was just when it started coming, I just felt everything. So I just got really excited. So anyway, it's a big story.
Right.
It's not just about
we'll talk about, you get to talk about your story a little bit more a bit later, but let's go on and give other people a chance to talk about their projects. Gabrielle, would you like to talk a little bit? It's exciting, Noreen. I'm really excited to come back to this, but yeah.
Yeah, so brief introduction. I'm a writer and also a cultural strategist. I'm working at the intersection of digital humanities and African arts and culture. So in terms of the writing part of this project, it's about food systems. My story is about food systems. It's about essentially a farmer slash scientist who is trying to almost revive some of staple foods of her culture after multiple overlapping apocalypses hit them. So it is about growing food, but it's also about preserving culture, which is one of my areas of interest. I'm very keenly aware of the losses and deaths of cultures that we face across the African continent, and I think we rarely approach climate justice as a culture issue, but it very much is. It is the process of climate adaptation will require a level of cultural dynamism that we need to start igniting now. And there's knowledge that needs to be preserved now in service of the future. So that's a bit about the story. Then in terms of doing work on the toolkits for the that will accompany the anthology, that has also been a really exciting opportunity to think through the utility of African speculative fiction. Like Naren, I don't often write. I write science fiction, but not as often as fantasy or horror or magical realism. And it's been exciting to think through the utility of all these kinds of stories that are a map for world making and for questioning our current realities.
Zan, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I am originally from South Africa, but I have been living in Finland and Sweden and back to Finland for several years now. I am autistic and I am non-binary, and my writing tends to focus more on fantasy as well, although I've also written several science fiction novels and short stories. As a music teacher, which is my primary job, I use stories all the time for pedagogical reasons because I teach primary school kids. So when I saw this project, I immediately understood how important story can be and how powerful story can be to convey messages or to start discussions or to provoke wondering, debate even in kids. So I immediately wanted to be part of this project, and I was nervous, as Noreen said, because I am not used to writing hard sci-fi or science fiction that cleaves so closely to real world science principles. I am someone who takes quite a lot of liberties and sprinkles in some sort of magic sometimes as well. But I really wanted to be part of this project because I believe in the power of storytelling, particularly from a pedagogical perspective. And it was such an honor to work with my scientist who I was paired with, Dr. Robin Lamble, who is as I understand, I might get this wrong, but I believe is a climate scientist with a focus on meteorology, which is my story, I initially pitched it as a story that looked at prediction models for climate change and how those prediction models start to fail and what the ramifications of that are, particularly for an Indigenous community that is using Indigenous knowledge and ancient traditional Indigenous practices, and how climate change and modernization and industrialization starts to kind of erode and interfere with that. And this is such an important topic to me because even though I'm a little bit removed now from Africa, I still very much feel South African in my heart and this profound connection to the African continent. And I also see what's happening to Indigenous communities here in Finland with the political treatment of the Sami people, who are traditional reindeer herders and live a very closely connected life with the land, and how changes, not just in climate here, but all kinds of infrastructure changes and political changes and socioeconomic changes here are dramatically and devastatingly impacting their life. So I wanted to explore the story, obviously through an African context, but in the hopes that it could be extrapolated to not just be seen as an inherently African problem, but rather a wider issue facing a lot of Indigenous people, particularly in atoll nations with rising ocean levels.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Amber, would you like to talk a little bit about your project?
Sure. So I'm a researcher at the University of Cape Town at an institute called Future Water, and I was partnered with Eugene Bacon, whose work was focused on a speculative space in southern Africa where there was even less water than we have now because we're already water scarce. And so my institute is a transdisciplinary research institute where I focus on health and environment, but not just from the public health perspective, also from the humanities and arts-based approaches in our research engagement. I'm trained in public health and conservation, but I do a lot of science communication and engaged science. So the Water Runner, the story that I worked on, really spoke to a future that we're trying to avoid. And so it was very exciting to think about how the work of the writer and the work that I'm doing could speak to one another around climate justice, around different types of epistemic justice, thinking about a future where the scarcity of water is present in everything people do. Because that's, I guess, part of what I try to do every day is get people to think about these topics in my research field. So, yeah, it was a very exciting process to work with a creative, to be able to focus on a creative output instead of creativity towards research outputs. And that was also an exciting partnership. So I think I've explained enough.
Marcy, would you like to go? Thank you for that.
Thank you. So I'm Marcy Mbolo. I'm a Kenyan, an agricultural economist based at the University of Nairobi. And for me, the project that we've been working with the Imperial College London, of course, in partnership with other organizations, it came to me as a default, but I think it is the difference in it that actually interested me, because I thought possibly I might get to learn something, and it might also change the way I see things. So out of that curiosity, because I mean, we never use stories as scientists, as epistemology, and therefore it was sort of strange, but I've come to appreciate it with time. Of course, I was partnered with Gabrielle, an interesting story. She's explained about it, Constellation Waters, and it highlights issues that are of interest to me, issues of climate change. Of course, she brings in the issues of indigenous knowledge, which is quite interesting. So for me, I've loved the story and the difference that it brings, or the new dimension that it brings to me as a scientist as I approach some of these issues as they emerge. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Let's get into then a little bit about, oh, before we keep going, I just want to let people know that if you have questions, please put them directly into the Q&A inside our Zoom events today. and that there is a Discord chat for this panel. It can be found under the program category, which is sorted by room. I think this is either streaming viral 1 or streaming virtual 2. Sorry, streaming virtual 1 or streaming virtual 2. And then inside that forum channel, there will be a post for this particular panel. And so let's get into our discussion then. Let's talk a little bit about the actual process of collaboration and what that looked like. I'd love to ask for the scientists and I think Mercy touched on this a little bit. What surprised you most about working with someone outside of your discipline? Anyone can answer. Like I'm not picking names. Anyone can just jump in and answer.
Mercy, do you want to go? I'm very happy to answer what was different for me in this process.
Okay.
Okay. So for me, as I said, I'm sitting on the scientist side, even though I do a bit of arts-based research approaches. But I've never had the opportunity to be able to do something creative for the sake of the creativity of it. And for me, that opportunity, without the kind of thinking about the research outputs or how the research process would go alongside the creative component, the creativity for the sake of it was really freeing, and that was very exciting.
Mercy, would you like to talk about a little bit as well?
Okay. For me, what was, let me say, interesting is how we look at the same issues of the food system. Of course, the story also talks about issues of climate change, land degradation, issues of biodiversity and all that, but from very different perspectives. Of course, for me, I'm confined to some sort of what I would call rational empiricism, and I'm interested in a very systematic way of sort of collecting data, testing these hypotheses, and of course, verification. And of course, I can't draw conclusion from imagination. And for me, it's the liberty with the science fiction to go beyond that and sort of use a different line of epistemology, what I would call maybe narrative empiricism. And for them, they are able to go deeper and imagine possibilities, and of course, bring in depth and a human lens to some of these issues. I think for me, that is what I found to be quite surprising. Yes, we are dealing with the same issues, but from different angles. The other thing is that, of course, I thought it is just stories, but of course, I was proved wrong. It's not just about stories. There is a lot that we can learn, and we can actually use science fiction as a source of knowledge and even use it as a tool for policy advocacy and even to educate.
Yeah, which is sort of the point of the project. I'm really glad that you found that particularly helpful. I know since you worked with Gabrielle, I'd love to also hear from Gabrielle about what she found in terms of what her assumptions shifted as well.
So something really interesting about working with Mercy was the threads that she drew out, and she extrapolated certain implications for like everything that I wrote. So things that I just plucked out of thin air. I remember I think I wrote something about algae fuel, and then Mercy was like, okay, but was it algae fuel? I remember it was a fuel. I was like, in this dystopia, they're using a fuel, a plant-based fuel. And she was like, okay, but this is a food crop. Why would they be using that for fuel? It brings up questions of like the ethics of this. And I was like, okay, well, that's actually something I never would have considered. And it's kind of made my writing tighter, especially because the purpose of this is to raise such questions of like the ethics of these things and who is affected who gains from this, who loses. I think that's the importance, or those are the kind of important questions that we should be asking with these stories. So she definitely was kind of like a conscience. She was the conscience of the story.
That's wonderful. Um, to the group in general, I'd love to ask, especially to the writers, what challenges came up for you guys in translating the science and data? Gabrielle, you already mentioned, like, oh, you had an idea and then you were kind of brought back down to earth, like, actually. Did other writers have some of these challenges in terms of like translating science or data and theory into narrative?
I think for me, it was a little bit intimidating because one of my concepts involved kind of like this rift in the universe and involved multiverse theory, which goes into like quantum physics, which I'm passionate about, but I'm not mathematically knowledgeable enough to fully understand it. So just trying to wrap my head around these pretty advanced concepts in a way that allowed me to convincingly then write about them in a fictional setting proved extremely challenging. And also just the overall approach to the story writing. I'm a person who usually starts with character first and some sort of image or emotion, and then builds a story around that character as a central figure. And to have to start with not just a concept, but a scientific concept or a hypothesis or a scientific premise, and then try to sort of populate that concept with characters that would then drive discussion, that was kind of antithetical to my creative process. And that proved incredibly challenging, but it was such a good mental exercise. And, as Gabrielle was saying about the thinking about like an aspect of world building, like the fuel being a crop that they would actually eat, and like how that's a contradiction in the story. It's really made me more conscious of some of the world building choices I make and will be making as I continue to write other stories.
I think also the sheer volume of research that I had to pack in a short amount of time. Granted, the topics that Annette and I discussed were very near and dear to my heart, but she gave me access to a lot of sort of reports and journals and documents. And reading it was very hard on an emotional level, and realizing how broken Africa is. And it just made me even more radicalized in a very anti-technocrat. I've become incredibly passionate about protecting Africa, and especially in looking at the legacy of centuries of colonialism and the absolute pillaging of our natural resources, and how we as people of this continent have become cut off from respect for the land. It terrifies me, and then I look at and then I catastrophize. So as I said, having all this information that Annette gave me, and feeling this absolute of despair of where do I even start. And thankfully there, my author brain that thrives on friction said, oh, start small, start with the character in this situation and know where you're going to end the story, and somehow manage to write this thing that flows to this absolutely heartbreaking. And everyone that's read the story said to me, okay, are you guys going to write a novel now? Where's the novel? So it's got legs. So it was very exciting, but also very scary because of looking at the immensity of the problem that I discussed. And at the end of the day, my story was actually not so much about the one thing, but as a snapshot of a particular future. And yeah, so that's basically it. But as I said, it's just the bigness of the research, which I found intimidating, because these scientific people are just so damn clever.
Very true, very true. I had a similar. I'm similarly intimidated as well. So yeah, I feel you there. Um, uh, was there any resistance? Something that I have experienced sometimes is a bit of resistance to the um, the imagineering that goes into sci-fi writing, sort of like, you know, you get a scientific idea, you know, concept, and then of course your writer brain goes into, oh, but what if this happened? And you know, you kind of get like, no, that would never happen because it's not scientific, or because it doesn't, you know. Um, did you guys as writers sometimes encounter that resistance? And for the scientists, did you sometimes also encounter on the other side like wildly speculative ideas that you were just kind of like, okay, I need to shut this down because that is not accurate, that is, you know, a misrepresentation of the science? Was there any like you know, kind of friction there? Jump, feel free to jump in, whoever.
I remember a specific instance of, I think, that kind of fiction. Um, so there's a scene in my story where two characters are rowing in a boat, and I think they're catching shrimp or something. And then one of the characters is like, oh, this is odd. This shrimp only has one head. And that is kind of to imply that, oh, so for the past, since these characters have been alive, there's been like this kind of mutation of animals, right? But this is a return to the norm, the norm, a new dawn where things are shifting to some sort of normalcy and where they can be at some kind of rest. And that was supposed to show how like foreign that kind of rest is for them with the lives that they've lived. And that was a metaphor. Mercy was telling me to justify my two-headed shrimp. I was, and I was like, I feel like there was that kind of fiction, but it made sense. I think within the context, what I really appreciate about Mercy's approach to the story is she took it very seriously. And I was really honored to have my work taken that seriously and so deeply considered. And yeah, I really appreciate that. But yeah, there was like friction that revealed like the different mindsets from which we're approaching the story, but nothing too serious. Just I think it just led to greater consideration of the story from different angles from both of us.
Yeah, I can't say that there was particularly friction. I think there were questions and there was challenge in some of the ideas that I raised with uh, sort of concepts, particularly when it got into the sort of quantum stuff, because I'm someone who is fascinated by the more mystical aspects of science in general and where the sort of intersection of some of the more esoteric philosophical practices meet science, particularly like in mathematics and things. But I can get derailed by that and go off into sort of very esoteric tangents. And having my scientists just challenge that a little bit and pull me back from that precipice and be like, yes, but how would this actually work? Or how are you going to explain this in terms of the actual science and what's happening? But then, to Robin's credit, I think he's also a writer in some capacity. And we actually ended up having much longer discussions. Again, like Noreen was saying, I think we scheduled about an hour and we could have easily chatted for 3 and we went over the time because we were both kind of throwing out ideas and feeding off of each other. And I really appreciated how quickly we were able to build rapport and find common ground in knowing that we both kind of wanted we both wanted the story to communicate the same thing and just how we could meld together our ideas and Robin's impressive knowledge and understanding of all things quantum and prediction model. And I don't know why I suggested a story based on prediction models when I have zero idea about prediction models and statistics and these things, but I have learned a lot. So yeah, it was more like challenge and discussion, I would say, rather than like friction.
I'd love to hear a little bit about this from a scientist's point of view, from all the scientists in the room. Percy, tell me about that scene from your point of view, that two-headed shrimp scene.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because for me, as I read the story, I'm looking at how is this coming to be? I want to interrogate the why and all that. Of course, I wouldn't catch the creative, but of course, I think we get to see the different dimensions and also get to appreciate that it's not always the way we think it should be, that um, certain setup can be used to communicate a different message altogether. Of course, for me, it is hard to get that. But of course, now with the interaction with Gabriela and the story, of course, you also get to understand that other side of the other side of the coin, which for me, of course, it's quite interesting to look at it that way. Yeah.
Amber, do you want to throw in something?
Sure. I was going to say that from in our partnership, the efforts were really to make sure that we understood each other and the point that was being made when it came to specifics around innovation in science or potential futures that could happen. I think as scientists, if we're not being a little creative and incorporating a little bit of magic, we're not innovating and we're not trying new things. So I think we do tend to do it, but we tend to do it, like Mercy said, with the how and the why as the leaders instead of the creativity first as the leaders. So I think the process between myself and the writer I was working with was really much more about, okay, am I understanding where you're trying to go with this in your creativity? And can I help you make it make sense in a way that works for the way we currently understand the world? Because I recognize that a lot of this is also about thinking about how the world might be different. And so there was just some questioning. I think I was very nervous about challenging the creativity, and so I was very careful to make it posed as questions rather than criticism or challenges. And I think that worked really well in our partnership as well. Because like everyone has said, this writing went the rewriting of the process and making it into a story that spoke to what we both understood was should be happening in the story was really really quick and quite easy. It was a very beautiful process.
And for everyone here, how could this kind of collaboration shift how African futures are imagined? Like, I think I want Onismus to start us out because, like, what do you see these kinds of collaborations, these kinds of um, perspective shifts? How do you think that they could affect the way that we think of our African futures, what futures could be?
Yeah, I think this has been a very good experiment, and as it's been alluded to by both the writers and the scientists, it's been quite fulfilling to both parties in terms of developing the stories, the writings that we so much need for teaching in higher education and other circles as well. But yeah, I think it's important to to come to the realization that there is very little in this space in terms of what is coming from the global south into the global north. And to bridge this particular gap, these sort of initiatives are crucial in terms of developing new ideas, new stories, new imaginations that can come and fill that void. And so timely for our project as a small step towards filling that gap in order to make it to make it a realization for the project. So it's been a very useful experiment, and I'm looking forward towards reviewing all the stories that have come in. Sorry about that.
Hello, guys. How are y'all? Okay. In that case, then what I'd love to ask is like, I know that in terms of your research, some of you guys have been already figuring out um where, African speculative fiction and African science can shift policy. Like there have already been examples of how this is affecting science and policy. Can some of you guys talk about that? About like things that are already going on, how people are already using these tools, how they're shifting policy. Um, Mercy, Gabrielle, Anismus, Amber, please, jump in and let us and talk about it.
Yeah, I can start off. I think it's crazy since I've started working on this project, I've been able to see so many examples of this. So for example, there's this organization in Uganda called Policy with two L's. They're a feminist data collective. And recently they put out a call for applications for a fellowship, a game design fellowship. So the idea is they're trying to find fellows to design games. So for context, they are kind of reimagining governance, right? So they advise African governments on policy shifts, and they're looking for someone to design a game to kind of use storytelling as a mapping tool. So we often don't realize how much of any type of invention is essentially an exercise in storytelling. Design is an exercise in storytelling. Like a policy document, if you read like anything, like if you read the SDGs, that is speculative fiction. I can promise you that. That's spec fic. So policy is essentially policy to a large extent is speculative fiction. So using storytelling as a tool to inject, to kind of affect the popular imagination and to to kind of map the impact of certain shifts in policy or certain technological developments is a no-brainer to me almost. And another utility I think of storytelling, I read this paper, the further considerations on Afrofuturism by Cordwell Shrum, where he basically lays out how essentially if you put two ideas in front of funders, let's say you want to develop two potential new technologies, you put these two ideas in front of people who are going to fund it, they are more likely to put money. Both of them are equally implausible, right? But one idea has been depicted over and over again in pop culture, in film, in sci-fi novels, right? They are going to put money into the one that they have a false sense of familiarity with because of popular culture. And the idea that gets more money, more funding, is likely much more likely to be developed. So science fiction has the capacity to literally shift reality, essentially. And I think we need to be very aware of all the impacts that our stories can have and be very critical as we write and very precise and aware of the implications of the stories that we are telling, of who we are including, what we are taking for granted. Like the example of what Mercy said about my story. Okay, so if we're using fuel, if we're using all these crops that could be used to feed someone to produce fuel, the person who is buying the fuel can probably afford whatever kind of automobile is being fueled, right? The person who needs this crop to eat probably cannot. Who gains, who loses? I think these are questions we have to ask ourselves consistently as we write about new developments in technology, no matter how magical they may seem. What power systems are at play here? I think we always need to ask these questions. And stories can be a tool that other sectors use to ask and answer these questions.
I'm gonna start calling names. Amber, go.
In the context of the games that Imperial had put together around this kind of mapping that Gabrielle's speaking about mapping futures and thinking about in our context, sustainability, we were very lucky to make use of the games that Onesimus and team have worked on to think about our own futures as a university and as an institution within the wider kind of communities in which we make big moves and where we're situated. And so we've used it with students and with staff to think about futures that are more sustainable and more just around our campus and our campus's reality within the city that it's built on or among. And so it's been an opportunity to think about a future that is more just, one that brings in the political economy and political ecology that Gabrielle's speaking about, the power relations, as well as the kind of resource extraction that happens at institutional level. And it's made, I think, researchers and students think much more about their impact, both as researchers and students, but also as an institution itself. And that's been really exciting for us because it was part of a larger project where campus efforts are focused on sustainability. But as Gabrielle said, the reality of the SDGs is that they are, for our context, a speculative fiction that we have to think about creatively if we want to be able to even imagine them for 2050, no less 2030 or 2060 or whatever. It's not going to happen in the next 5 years unless people start really thinking, or at all, but unless people start really thinking intentionally about these futures. And so that's what the games allowed us to do, and that's been really exciting.
Unmute. We've got about 15 minutes on this panel. We've got a couple of audience Q&A questions, and so I'm gonna take that. And for the Q&A, whoever wants to answer, please feel free. Jump in with comments or anything like that. Don't wait for me to call on you. Our first question here is from Robert Thompson. Historically, speculative fiction has written about things before they happened. Example, rocket ships to the moon, electronic tablets. Do the scientists in the project get new ideas, new directions from the writers? Jump in, guys.
Okay, so I guess as representing a scientist in the context where we were working, some of what I was offering was the stuff that is on the cutting edge of what we're already doing. So resource recovery from wastewater, for example. But certainly I think it also offers opportunities to push the scientists to think further beyond what's already on the cusp of happening. And so certainly I think the answer is yes.
Mercy, did you have a similar experience, like getting new ideas, new directions?
Yeah, I think for me, as a speculative science fiction help us to imagine the futures, then you're able to work backwards as scientists and see how best then can you even model, even when you're doing simulations and try to see what is likely to be the outcome. Then you're able to use some of those speculations and input them into a model as variables and be able to get even better simulations as you work with science fiction. So for me, I think it's helpful, it's important, and it improves even. Let me not use the word accuracy, but it improves how we do modeling as scientists. Yes, it does.
Yeah, I think it's a very important marriage between science fiction and the modeling, just building on what Mercy is been talking about. I tend to develop bespoke tools for countries. So we developed a tool for Nigeria, for example, that looks at decarbonization strategy between a time period up to 2050 and now expanded to 2060. And also we've done the same for Kenya. We developed a tool, a Kenya carbon reduction tool that does the same. And this sort of imagination in terms of its different sectorial areas within the country and how they can decarbonize really come to fore. and also in terms of creative thinking, bringing people together, what we've just been talking about, having an element of humanity within those tools so that they are not just tools that are created for scientists and left on a shelf, but anybody can also be able to participate in developing their own sort of individual pathways for decarbonization into the future is actually vital. And this is where I see the marriage between science fiction and the other bit of science that comes together into play to bring a greater strength in terms of imagination.
That actually segues beautifully into our second question, which was from Miguel O. Mitchell. What kinds of stories are the primary education children reading or will read that come out of this project? So I think that kind of has us kind of talking a little bit about how are we using these stories and tools, and how accessible are they for the general public? Yeah, I'd love to hear that. Nismas, if you want to go, and anyone else who wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, so the toolkit that we are developing is going to be accessible to the public, and people will be able to use it for their own teaching and application in their own centers or education institutions. As far as the primary school level is concerned, I don't think they will play that a critical role. I see Xan shaking her head. They are really sort of centered around higher education rather than primary education level. But that doesn't mean that the educators within the primary school setup cannot be able to use the resource and sort of scale it down to the level of their students in that sort of sense.
Yeah, I think that we wrote, sorry, just to hop in, I think we wrote thinking that the stories were intended for high school and tertiary education level. But I think maybe a new project might be to team up with illustrators as well, and to actually develop picture books on some of these topics that could introduce these very real world issues in an age appropriate way to younger readers. And I know personally, I'd love to have those kinds of books in my school for our kids.
I'd like to also just highlight an initiative here in South Africa called Book Dash, where they get illustrators together with editors, writers, and graphic designers, and they sit in one day, in 8 hours, they have to come up with a story which gets illustrated, edited, written, and everything. And these books are available as open source files for people to download anywhere in the world and to print. And then they also get sponsorship to print. And these books then go out to communities in areas where there is no access to libraries. So we could ostensibly look at something like that for these stories, just the thought.
And are there long-term plans? A final question from Soila Kenya, who asks, what are the long-term plans, if any, for this partnership?
Yeah, so I think long-term plans, we do have long-term plans. We would like to, and we are in the process of applying for funding to do some workshops, writing workshop in Africa, in Kenya, and perhaps even Uganda. We also want to continue the small group seminars that we've instituted at both University of Nairobi and also at Imperial, and also waiting for this toolkit to come alive so that we can also be able to use it and spread the gospel around various STEM-based institutions who will also want to use the toolkit for their pedagogical approaches. So some things there that we are still thinking and planning. There will be also some seminars coming up that that we might want people to participate going forward.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, we have about 5 minutes left on our panel. I wanted to ask sort of like a closing question to everyone here, which is why does African science fiction need science, and why do African scientists need fiction? And I think we've all sort of hinted a little bit about that around, conceptions of future and what does and who gets to define it, who gets to understand it, right? But I'd love to hear a little bit more from everyone else too. If you could just take 1 or 2 minutes to talk about why you think African speculative fiction needs science and why science need African speculative fiction. So, yeah.
Oh gosh, I think that science needs African speculative fiction in particular because Africa is so often maligned as this dark continent that doesn't have as much to offer. And I feel that it aggravates me and hurts, and it's so woefully, it's such awful disinformation. And I think that the scientific world could absolutely benefit from understanding ancient practices on the African continent that have aided and allowed these communities to thrive, even if it looks different from Western perspectives. And it's certainly time. I mean, look at the world that we're in. The Western way of thinking has destroyed. The world is not thriving with this Western perspective. And I think if we can eradicate some of that and return to some of the indigenous ways of life and ways of being and ways of interacting with the environment, we would be far better off in the world than we are now. Because the world needs hope. And I think this is where our stories maybe inject a little bit of hope into what I might imagine may otherwise be a bit of dismal science.
Irene, I saw you now.
Yeah. So something about Africa is it's often about community and family. And when I say family, it's also including found family. And we are, I think, if I look at just in my immediate environs, what matters is how people relate to each other and the connections they make that transcend what's skin deep. And we've got so much potential here. And we've also got a very strange situation where we've got, if you look at how many South Africans, for instance, we are very aware of what's going on in the United States, for instance, and Britain and other places. But if you ask them about us, they know nothing. We're just this land where there's people who live in mud huts and ride elephants to school. I mean, literally, I have had people ask me, do you have electricity? Yes, we do. I promise you, those are the kinds of questions I've had. So being able to amplify our voices and sort of show that the diversity of culture that we've got here is important. And maybe some people can also learn from how we've one of a very common theme in my fiction is how sometimes societies are no longer pure. They're distorted by the interactions, sometimes in interactions that are enforced from dominant cultures onto other cultures that are perhaps not equipped to deal with this intrusion. And there's sometimes a very strange sort of fusion that happens. And I feel that Africa, there's that fusion that happens. There's an excitement, and we've got so much to give. And as a writer, I like the idea of being able to give a voice to that magic that happens here, despite all the terrible things. So that's my thought.
Yeah, I agree. And just to briefly add to that, there's a quote by Walida Imarisha that goes, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. We're science fiction walking. We're our ancestors' wildest dreams. And I think it is our role as writers to imagine wilder dreams, because that is the basis for all innovation. And Another thing I just want to point out is when we think about African knowledge or indigenous knowledge, we often think about knowledge of the past, of some far past, but there's knowledge being created on the continent in the present. And culture is dynamic, it changes and it moves and it is very alive. So beyond the knowledge that we reach back for, there's also valuable knowledge that's springing up today. And I think that's another thing that we need to keep our eyes and minds on.
Well, with that, we have come to the end of this moderated conversation. I want to say huge thank you to everyone who made it today. We are just a small fraction of the writers and scientists who are working on this project. And hopefully, if we have given anyone a glimpse into what's happening, I assure you that the reality is far, far more expansive and exciting. And I can't wait for all the stories that are going to come out. If you want to learn more about this project, go to appliedafricansf.com. I want to put it in the chat, but I don't think everybody's gonna get that chat. I don't know. So you can also find a little bit more about the writers at africansfs.com, which is the African Speculative Fiction Society website. And yes, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, panelists, for being here and for taking time to answer these crazy questions. Good luck, everyone, and yeah, keep an eye out. You're going to be seeing some cool ass stuff from this project. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day and safe journey. Take care.
Thank you. Bye bye for now. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.